My name is Kate Tarrant and I work for the Lower Blackwood Landcare Group. For those of you that don't know us, we are a not-for-profit independent landcare organisation with an interest in sustainable agriculture and the broader environment and river health in the Lower Blackwood catchment. You can find out more about us and the work we do on our website at lowerblackwood.com.au. Before we kick off, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we all live and work. I acknowledge the Wadandi Bibbulmun people of the Bibbulmun Nation and pay our respects to elders past, present and future. Just a few words about how the webinar will run today. You'll have noticed that you can hear but not speak yourselves, and that's deliberate so we can keep things moving along at a good pace. You can definitely still ask questions though, so please don't be shy. Just type your question in at any time into the chat box and I'll make sure it gets asked at the end of the presentation. Also, if you do run into any technical difficulties, please use the status button, which is the hand on the bottom right side of your screen, and to let me know, and I'll see if I can fix it from our end. Don't worry though, if you have to leave early or drop out, as we will be recording the session, which I'll email out to you next week. Okay, to the reason we have all tuned in today, I'm delighted to have talking with us Carbon Farming Foundation and founder and CEO Lachy Ritchie. Growing up on the land, Lachy is passionate about supporting the uptake of farming practices that build soil health, improve the water cycle and enhance biodiversity. This support has taken many forms, including the co-founding in 2018 of Regen Farming News, an online news and knowledge hub that is now a dedicated global audience of farmers. More recently, Lachy teamed up with WA businessman Norman Pater to establish the CFF. In today's presentation, Lachy will simplify the seemingly complex world of carbon farming into a straightforward step-by-step explanation of what it is, how the system works, and the different ways that farmers can be involved, addressing all the pros and cons. He'll also introduce us to the Carbon Farming Foundation and explain CFF's easier and cheaper do-it-yourself model, walking us through an example on how to set it up, design and manage a carbon project from beginning to end. So welcome, a big welcome to you, Lachy, and I'll hand over.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kate. Pleasure to be here. We've got a lot to get through, so I'll get stuck straight into it. Now, so what we are going to cover today is I'm going to break this down in a few different sections. I'm going to talk about the basics of carbon farming, just so that everyone has a clear understanding of what it is, how it works. I'm going to run through our do-it-yourself model and how it is different to other models in the market. And then we're going to talk through getting started. So basically a few live real examples. We'll talk numbers, costs, and we'll help you understand kind of the steps to get going on your own carbon journey. And then we'll have some time for Q&A as well. So let's just get these slides working. So to kick off, I just want to say who we are and why we exist. So we're a non-profit foundation that was founded in 2020. And basically, we're founded around this belief that farmers are the heroes of net zero. They're in this unique position to be able to earn money and boost productivity on their land while sucking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it in trees and soil. The world needs this. It can't get to net zero without farmers, and farmers deserve credit where credit is due. But it's about so much more than emissions alone. We know that farmers getting more carbon flowing in the system increases productivity, enhances soil health, builds drought resilience, and ultimately improves the health of the land. So it's this amazing win-win opportunity that we gathered around. Now, the problem is that in the carbon market as it currently stands, things are generally unnecessarily confusing. It's difficult to get started, and existing delivery models are quite expensive for landowners. So the result is there's a lot of farmers still sitting on the fence, not knowing who to trust or where to start. So our purpose as an organisation is to make it drastically cheaper and simpler for farmers to integrate a profitable carbon crop into their existing farming operations. Ultimately, what we want to see is healthier landscapes and more money in a farmer's pocket, because farmers deserve to be rewarded for making net zero happen. So that is a bit about us. Now let's get into it. So what is carbon farming? Now, in its simplest form, carbon farming is built off a methodology or a rule book. Now, you basically have to implement new farming activities on your property according to the rules. Now, it could be planting trees, changing the way you manage your crops or your livestock to generate. Basically, if you can sequester carbon and store it by this new activity and it complies with the rules, that's the activity you undertake. You then have to prove it, and that's usually a combination of measurement and computer models. You are then issued with carbon credits. There's checks and balances along the way, audits, third-party verification, but ultimately you get issued with credits. And then you have an obligation to maintain that carbon that you put in the ground or in a tree. That's it in its simplest form. So who writes the rule books? Basically, there are a whole range of different accreditors. Now, the one you would have heard about, obviously, is the Australian government. So most of the methods we talk about in Australia relate to the Australian government methodologies, but there's also a whole heap of others. There's globally recognised standards and new emerging standards. Now, each of those groups have a whole range of different rule books for a whole range of different things. So they'll have different types of tree carbon methods. There might be methods for changing how you feed your livestock, soil carbon methods. Really, what it's about is knowing that there is a huge range of options out there, and it's just about understanding what can possibly apply to your farm and who can help you with all the different methods. Kind of think of it as different flavors in the ice cream shop. It's just about choosing what works for you. And there's really, there's not much point getting too bogged down in all the different methods. It's really about starting with what works on your farm and then trying to find a method that fits for you. Now, what is a credit? So a carbon credit is 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent. Now, it's a financial product, so it's basically, think of it like a share. Now, it's held in your account with the accreditation body that created it for you. So those people we saw a moment ago, those logos, each one of those have a ledger, much like a share registry, and they keep tabs of who owns carbon credits and who's swapping and trading with who. Now, with your carbon credits, you've got 3 choices of what you do with them. You can either retire them, which is if you want to be carbon neutral, for example, say you want to sell a carbon neutral product. You can reduce your emissions as best you can, but you may always have some emissions that you need to offset. So basically 1 tonne of carbon, 1 carbon credit is retired or cancelled to offset your emissions to get you to 0. Now, the other option is you can hold the carbon. It sits on your balance sheet and it accumulates in value the same as a share would. You can also hold them for future security because you might need them for carbon neutrality later, or you basically just don't know what you might need them for, so you can just hold them as long as you want, basically. Now, the other option, of course, is trading them. Now, you can trade either by selling on the spot market or through forward contracts. Basically the same as you would handle any other commodity. You can there's different market mechanisms for how you sell it. It's not that different to other things that you already buy and sell. So who's buying these things? Basically, the government is buying them. So basically, on behalf of Australian taxpayers, they are buying carbon credits to reduce our collective emissions. There's also compliance markets, which is basically where a company that might be a heavy emitter is told or mandated by regulation that they have to buy some carbon credits. Now, there's also the voluntary market, which is the one that you might hear a bit about, kind of booming at the moment. Basically, that is all these companies that are making net zero pledges and that they're promising to get to net zero because their customers or shareholders are demanding it. Now, there's a huge boom of this going on, and some of this research here is from McKinsey. And even with the commitments to date on the left-hand side, there's going to be 200 times the demand for carbon credits as there is currently by 2050. Now, some of these other graphs show obviously a much more exciting proposition. They are based on different working groups and research methodologies around the world. This is effectively McKinsey research. And they're predicting that it's going to become a $50 billion industry by 2030. And interestingly, they're also predicting a drive for people, not just quantity, but also quality of carbon credits. So people are going to start digging more deeply into what is the underlying carbon credit that I'm buying to understand the true value. So selling it, let's talk price and where the heck you sell these things. So basically you can sell them to the government through government auctions that they hold on a regular basis. You can trade on the spot market. You can engage in forward contract sales, or you can privately sell. So there's nothing stopping you going directly to someone who wants to buy carbon credits, like an energy company, and directly selling your carbon to them. As long as you're only selling your carbon, it's completely okay. Now, the other thing to note is there is the possibility that if you have a really good story behind your carbon, it's the same as any other product on farm. If you have a great story and brand sitting behind it, you can demand a premium above the spot price. Now, that graph there shows you what the spot price has been doing of the last 2 years when it comes to carbon. And it's been a little bit of a bumpy road of late, and in question and answer time, I can probably get on to why we've seen that big spike and decline, basically due to some government policy changes, but I can explain that a little bit later. So how do you access selling to these people? Basically, at the moment, it's generally done through brokers, and some carbon service providers provide this service for you and trade carbon on your behalf. You can sell direct, like I said, knock on Woodside's door and try and sell them some credits. The other thing that's really worth noting is that there is a carbon exchange in development. So if you started a carbon project now, by the time you actually had carbon credits to sell, it's going to be as easy as going online and trading shares. So it's getting easier and easier by the day is the key message here. So your yield, how do you know how much carbon you're going to generate? So there's different methodologies, and they're usually a combination of modeled or measured methods, whether they either are using government computer models to generate values, or you're actually going out and measuring in the field, or often a combination of both. So I won't get into the details of how the models, etc., work because we're a bit short on time, but all I'll say is that the underlying things that influence the yield of your carbon credits is your climate, your particularly rainfall, obviously, your soil, your topography of the paddocks and that you're putting into the carbon project, and also your management. So there's a lot that comes down to you and how you manage your land that will influence the yield of the carbon. Now, the other thing to note is that there is a yield curve. You don't get awarded carbon credits in a linear way over the duration of your project. This curve example here is from a reforestation project. And as you can see from this, you're getting the bulk of your carbon credits within the first 10 years. So 60% of your carbon actually lands in the first 10 years. Now, the other thing to note is you can choose when you get issued with carbon credits. So there's a bit of tactics at play here. You can't go more than 5 years without issuing a report and then getting your credits. Now, every time you get credits, it requires issuing a new offset report to the government. Now, that comes with costs. So it's really a game here of going, well, how often do I want cash flow from my carbon versus the cost of reporting to work out when I want to do it. So here's an example for a reforestation project where you might put in a claim at year 3, get 11% of your credits. Year 6, get 24%. Year 10, 25%. And then you trail out 15, 20, 25 thereafter. That's just a kind of example of what we would generally recommend is a pretty good strategy to balance that need for some cash with your cost of getting the credits issued. Now, this is a really important topic that takes a little bit of thinking time to wrap your head around. Is the way carbon projects work generally is that there is a 25-year crediting period. So to be clear, you only get paid for 25 years worth of carbon gains. Now, you then get a choice as to whether you will what they call a permanence period. Now, a permanence period is basically your obligation for how long into the future you will look after that carbon or keep that activity in place. So if you planted trees, it's how long you will protect the trees for. If it's a soil carbon project, it'll be how long you're going to maintain the activities that you said you were going to maintain to keep carbon in the ground. So you get to choose 25 or 100 years. Now, the permanence period starts from your first credit issuance. So if the project starts on the far left there, and let's say you get 3 or 4 years in and you get your first issuance of credits, you lodge your report, you get credits issued. That is when the permanence period begins. Just so you know, there's a little bit of an offset there. Now, if you choose a 100-year permanence period, so you were going to look after that carbon for 100 years, you get to keep 95% of the carbon credits that are generated during the 25-year crediting period. So they take 5% away as a little bit of a risk of reversal buffer. Basically, it's just a little bit of insurance in case the models weren't quite right, the measurement wasn't quite right, or there's it's just kind of sharing the risk amongst the whole pool of carbon projects Australia-wide. Now, if you do a 25-year permanence period, because it's obviously a lot less of an obligation, a lot shorter window, they take an extra 20% of the carbon credits away to put into this insurance buffer. So the important thing to note, 25-year permanence, you get 75% of the carbon. 100-year permanence, you get 95% of the carbon. So really, it's just about crunching numbers in your feasibility to assess which option is best for you, depending on your activity that you're undertaking. So the other thing to note is that if you produce any net emissions as part of your new carbon activity, they get taken away from your carbon credits. So the example here is a soil carbon project. If you, for example, were running a cropping operation, and then your intervention is to convert to high intensity rotational grazing, you need to look at your emissions from cropping and then your emissions from the grazing enterprise. And if those emissions have gone up, they will subtract that from the carbon credits that you're issued. Just an important little one to note that emissions calculations do come into play in this carbon farming game. What are the costs? It's not dissimilar to a lot of your agricultural enterprises. You'll have direct costs associated with implementing the activity itself. Could be planting trees, soil sampling costs, fencing inputs, agronomy, labour, all those kind of direct costs that you're accustomed to. You will usually have some consultant costs for technical support. Could be you get some coordination assistance or some assistance with reporting, for example. Again, not that dissimilar to a lot of other things that you would grow. Now, the other costs are that there can be auditing or accreditation costs. You may be sharing some of your carbon with a service provider. There can be cost of finance, like anything else, broker fees if you're trading through a broker, and then you might have some software costs associated with running the project to do some of the technical heavy lifting. Risks. So obviously, there's a lot to think about here in undertaking a carbon project. And obviously, the big one is land use opportunity costs. This is a long-term game, and you really need to be sure about what your different land use options are and if this is the best land use for you. And I'll talk about some mitigation strategies in a moment. The other thing is price fluctuation, which is just, it's like any crop or anything you're dealing with. Prices go up and down, and it's a new market to wrap your head around. And it's just the same way you keep tabs on what's happening with your wool or your lamb or your wheat prices. Carbon is a new commodity for you to get your head around just from a pricing perspective. Now, there is a risk of reversal, which is an important one to discuss that's really upfront from the start. Basically, the way it works is if there's what they call a reversal event, which is basically you're going along, you're doing everything you've said you would, and you're successfully sequestering carbon in trees or soil. Something happens that causes the carbon pool to go backwards. So in a tree example, that could be that a fire comes through. In a soil carbon example, it could be that you're hit with drought, for example, and photosynthesis is stopped on the farm. You're not pumping carbon into the soil, and it starts to go backwards a bit because it gets chewed up by microbes. Now, in both of those instances, you are allowed to pause the project to catch up. So you are given basically a little bit of leeway with the accreditor to pause, say, look, this event happened, it's outside my control, and you get a period of time to catch up, and then click, you restart the project and off you go again. So the only time you actually have to pay back the credits is if you either voluntarily cancel the project because you changed your mind, or after that period of time, you can't catch up. Let's say a fire was so intense that the trees have been killed, and you don't want to replant them to regrow the forest and catch up. That is an instance in which case you're basically cancelling the project. Now, if you cancel the project, you have to repay the carbon credits to the accreditor, which is a really important thing to know. Also, it's really important to know that if you have a third party involved and they have taken carbon credits, those carbon credits are still owed to the regulator. So it's really important to kind of follow that trail of obligation. The other thing to wrap your head around is just if you decide ever to sell the property. So incoming buyers either will think the carbon credit project is fantastic and it's a great new revenue stream and I want to keep it, or they might say, well, I don't want to keep the carbon project. In which case you can you basically have to look at cancelling the project. Now, that's, again, something that's just going to come into play in your sale negotiation, that there will be a cost to cancel the project and pay back carbon credits. Again, something to wrap your head around. So let's talk about mitigating some of these risks. Really, the most fundamental thing that we talk about when it comes to a carbon project is that this is just a new crop, and you have to think about it that way. Overall farm productivity must come first in the farm planning. So it really is about saying, how does getting more carbon flowing in my system increase the resilience of my operation, increase my overall productivity? You start there and you go, where are the sweet spots around my farm where these activities make logical sense anyway for the long term? Then you come back and think, well, what methodologies or rule books are available that can reward me with carbon credits for those activities that I wanted to do anyway? Now, a good example here is the Willamby farm, which you can see an image of on the screen, which we're a partner in. Now, that project is, you'll see that we've put windbreaks and shelter belts and wildlife corridors all through the farm to divide it up into smaller cells, because they were very large paddocks, largely monoculture cropped, back-to-back cereal cropping. So this farm went, for the sake of productivity and resilience, we want to move to more of a mixed operation. We want to increase livestock numbers. We want to get smaller cells so we can manage rotation better. And we want shelter belts and windbreaks for shade and evapotranspiration protection against the hot winds. Basically, you're looking at what makes sense for the farm and then layering carbon over the top as an opportunity. Now, the other thing to think about is diversifying your carbon crops, the same as you would any other crop. So to us, it doesn't make sense to put all your eggs in the basket of one methodology. Why not spread it around? Do a bit of soil carbon, a bit of pine plantation here, or a reforestation project there. It's just another good strategy. The other thing is that this carbon farming is a long game, and you've got to have that mindset from the start. We really advocate strongly that you keep control of your credits. Don't have huge chunks, 30, 50% of them going to a third party, because you just get a lot more risk there in that reversal risk instance, or if you cancel the project and change your mind. Lock-in contracts are something to keep an eye out for and avoid. And the other thing is just the long game strategy of holding versus trading the carbon. You might need it one day. So we really advocate to people to think of it as a superannuation fund, park it away for the distant future, and think of it as a bonus in 10, 20, 30 years' time. All right, so we've covered a lot. And we're doing well for time, so that's great. Let's get stuck into do-it-yourself carbon farming, how the Carbon Farming Foundation comes into play. So again, coming back to our mission, we want to see more carbon farming happen, more carbon crops in Australia, and more farmers benefiting from this new opportunity. But when we looked at what was going on in the market and the industry, we really saw that farmers getting involved had two choices at either end of a spectrum. You could basically go it alone and learn how to do everything yourself, with a real lack of publicly available knowledge and information, essentially confusing, really difficult. Now, the other end of the spectrum is what you might call a full service offering, which is what is available by a lot of the larger carbon project developers. Now, generally, it's quite a hands-off model Sometimes they directly own the carbon project and they run it. Sometimes they fund it. Sometimes they don't. Generally, they're taking 30 to 50% of the carbon credits off the table as a project management fee for running this project on your land. And the other thing is often the contracts have you locked in. They're very hard to get out of. So we really saw these two ends of the spectrum and not a lot of variation in what was available for landowners. And we felt that was holding back the industry. So we came up with a do-it-yourself model for carbon farming. Basically, we think that carbon should be grown, managed and sold just like any other crop. Farmers just need a bit of a helping hand to get started in this new industry and learn how to integrate it into their farming system. Now, under our model, farmers get to choose their level of support. You can be a bit more hands-on or a bit more hands-off. And essentially, the more work you put into the project, the more profit you make. The model also slashes delivery costs. By getting farmers directly involved in the carbon project, you can bring your costs way down. You don't have a team of consultants driving around the country racking up kilometres and hotel bills. If you think about the example for tree carbon or reforestation projects, for example, you could get a farmer involved in deep ripping or fencing or planting the trees directly themselves to bring the costs way down from using expensive third-party contractors. Now, under our standard fee structure, farmers can aim to keep 95 to 100% of the credits, generally speaking. There's no lock-in contracts or exclusivity with our model. There's clear and simple cancellation pathways that everyone understands from the start. And there's also shared risk. If the project doesn't work, we give back any carbon credits that we've earned for the life of the project. And I'll talk specifically about our fees in a moment. Now, what you actually get, what are our services? So we map things out in a really simple step-by-step process. We basically lay it all out on a silver platter so that you can run the project yourself. We have an easy software product that maps things out from start to finish, puts the project on autopilot. Think automatic reminders, issue your reporting through there, grab data through your farm management system, trying to make it all as easy as possible. We provide training, guidebooks, templates for reports and documents you need, and a whole lot of resources to help the process. We connect you to funding and trading options to sell your carbon or source investment upfront. We have a national network of vetted subcontractors that can help to deliver the project with you. And then, of course, we provide technical support and advice for the duration of the project as and when you need it. Now, it's also what's critical to our model is a partnership-based approach where we really value local knowledge. We don't think as a nationally based body, we can parachute into any region and tell people how to sequester carbon in that area. Really comes down to local knowledge and local experience as to what will and won't work in a particular region. So the way the different roles are laid out is that the landowner is the project owner. They own it, it's registered under their name. They provide the land, they run the farm, and they run the project as much as they feel comfortable doing. Now, we partner with local experts. An example of local experts is land care groups. So land care groups, it could be foresters or agronomists, for example, that come in and provide technical on-ground local know-how, services as needed, and coordination support as needed. So this is really a critical pillar of our model, is these locally based partnerships. So think of us, that the CFF, as remote support. We stick to regulation, risk, compliance, really navigating all those different rule books and making sure you dot your I's and cross your T's in all the paperwork. We map things out in a really simple step-by-step process and simplify everything for you. And really, we're here to help navigate this new industry and this new opportunity. And we have a really transparent fee structure that we're really happy to share and make public. Now, just to note as well, I'm going to make these slides available to you. So there's a little bit more detail in the next few slides that I won't talk through, but you can read through in your own time. Simplest way to understand our fee structure is that we have our DIY toolkit, which is basically our project management software, templates, guidebooks, training, knowledge, connections, all of our intellectual property, knowledge and know-how. is packaged up for you. And for that, we take 100 carbon credits per annum and 2.5% of any carbon credits issued. Now, that fee structure basically has a flag fall and then a success fee amount. And that is so that we can charge the same for small or large projects, and it's just transparent and upfront. We're not moving that percentage around depending on how well we negotiate with the landowner. It's fixed. Now, it's a risk share. So if the carbon credits need to be paid back, we will give back our share of the carbon credits. Now, if you want to keep 100% of your carbon credits, you can just pay us fees in lieu of those credits, and they're only payable on successful issuance of carbon credits. Now, the next two chunks of work are basically a whole lot of services around setting up your carbon project. So that's to help with all the regulation and documentation, reporting, work plans, farm mapping. For a soil carbon project, it's to do with stratification and soil sample plan design for your project. So basically, we do all of that work as well, kind of as much as little or as little as you need. If you don't need us, you don't pay for any of our time. Now, just to give you a ballpark, recent projects we've quoted on are spending between $15,000 to $35,000 at this setup stage. And I'll talk more about specific numbers for you in a moment. Now, the next chunk there is ongoing services. Now, usually associated with getting your credits issued, there is a need for an offset report and a fair bit of legwork to pull all the paperwork together and get all the data. So we can do that for you. And the ballpark figure, again, is about $10,000 to $20,000 per crediting round. But we're hoping that figure is going to come way down as these processes get more automated and the regulators improve the way you have to do this. The other thing is compliance, coordination, and technical support. Again, just as you need it, when you need it. So a lot of our model is about only pay for what you need when you need it, essentially. And a lot of people are kind of budgeting around the $1,000 to $4,000 per annum for our technical support. It may be nothing, and then a few extra $1,000 in a year where you're thinking about some strategy or some future planning. But this gives you a bit of a ballpark of the kind of costs involved, because again, we're happy to share this information and be very upfront about how it works. The other thing just to note is we are a non-profit organisation again. So any money we make ultimately just goes back to helping more Aussie farmers. We just do charge for our services to keep the lights on and have a sustainable long-term future as a foundation. All right, we're motoring along. So the toolkits that are currently available is that we're basically focused at the moment on the high rainfall and wheat and sheep zones. We're working within the soil carbon method, the environmental plantings or reforestation method, and then also plantation forestry. Now, coming soon, we're going to bring some of those international carbon credit methods into Australia. We've got a method that'll come online late this year, early next year for mixed farming operations, and it's particularly targeting cropping, large broadacre cropping systems, and potentially getting carbon credits for nitrogen use efficiency and other farming activities within a cropping context. The other thing we're doing is we are developing a tree planting method that will deliberately target small-scale landowners, because the current ERF-based methods for reforestation can be a bit cost prohibitive for very small projects. We're creating a new method and lodging it with one of those accreditors that we touched on very early in the preso. And that will be live later on this year. So we've got a few other things happening in the toolkit to keep an eye on. Now, we're a fairly new foundation, as I mentioned, only founded late 2020, but we've got live projects on the ground in New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, and we're looking to sign some up in South Australia at the moment, and of course, Western Australia, working with anything from family scale farmers up to some of the largest corporate ag companies in the country. So very fortunate to be ripping straight into it and getting started with some good demand Australia-wide. All right, take a breath. We're still tracking well, and we're going to have plenty of time for questions. Now, let's go to some actual worked examples and how this rolls out. So we break the process down into 6 steps. You have this upfront feasibility. You have sign-off, which is where, feasibility is where you're scoping out what's possible on your farm. what rule book applies to your farm, and then show us the numbers. What does this actually look like if I crunch the costs and returns on my farm? Sign off is where you get your head around contracts, obligations, rules. Maybe you need some project funding, or you want to forward sell some of your carbon to lock in a price. All that happens at sign off. Then your project clicks go officially, and you get into design and planning. Now, design and planning might be ordering seedlings, for example, which can take up to 9 months or 12 months even to order your seedlings. Working out where everything's going to go, who's going to do what, engaging contractors, project planning, the whole thing. You've then got your setup or implementation phase where you're actually doing the work to get the project started. That might be planting trees, for example, fencing, earthworks. In a soil carbon project, that is where you do your baseline sampling, where you basically have to go around to your farm according to strict rules and do samples to send off to a lab to get the baseline of your current soil carbon levels. You then manage the project on an ongoing basis for the next, basically the duration of your permanence period. Now, then at the end of all of that, you get carbon credits that are coming in over the crediting cycle, and you're trading those carbon credits. Now, what's going to work for you on your farm? So let's talk about the three main methods that we're dealing with at the moment. So for a soil carbon project, basically you have to implement a new materially different activity on your farm that is going to sequester carbon and keep it in the soil. There are a whole range of eligible activities, and some of the ones, for example, are stubble retention, moving to a no-till system, cover cropping, integrating legume species into a rotation, soil amelioration, changing your grazing management, etc. If you have a strategy for how you can change what you're currently doing to build soil carbon and keep it there, this is potentially a fit for you. Now, there are some restricted and not allowed activities, which is getting quite into some nitty-gritty. But basically, start with a plan of what you want to do. The first question with a soil carbon project is really, how am I going to sequester carbon? What is my strategy? And if that is sound, then worry about carbon credits and methodologies and rules. Now, again, I'll send this to you so you can go through some of the finer detail, but I'll keep moving so we don't bog down too much time. For a plantation forestry project, which is hardwood and softwood for saw logs or pulp, so it could be blue gums, could be pine trees, for example. There's a whole range of methods as to whether you're planting a new plantation or you're changing the rotation length of an existing plantation, or you're keeping an existing plantation where it would have been taken out and converted back into pasture, for example. Basically, they crunch the numbers and go, well, if this was going to continue down its current path, this is the carbon level. Your changed management brings the carbon level to here, so we'll pay you for the gap, the difference in between. So plantation forestry is something to consider. Now, the other one is obviously native planting of trees. So native species being planted as shelter belts, wind breaks, or large block plantings. And generally, like I said, they're used for shelter breaks or wildlife corridors. They do have to reach 2 meters high, the trees, and they have to get to 20% crown cover as a whole in that area. Now, it's pretty sparse. That's basically a sparse woodland. So if you can establish relatively sparse woodland in an area of your farm, and this project makes sense for you. Now, the other point to note is you can't do this on an area that has had forest cover within the last 5 years. So you can't chop down a pine plantation and then put native tree reforestation on top. That's not going to work. There's a few little technicalities there, but generally speaking, these are kind of the three main options to consider, especially in the region of Lower Blackwood region. So moving on from there, how we would help you with this is that this is a bit of a sneak preview of our carbon project management software. So you can see from the menu down the side that eventually this software will help you from end to end all the way through the project to eventually selling your credits. and you'll be able to manage multiple projects across your farm in one easy to use interface. So with this feasibility stage, which we'll talk about, what we can currently help you do is map the carbon yield from a tree carbon project on your farm. So this is what is called the full cam model, which I don't have time to delve into in depth. But basically, we have an integration with the government's computer model, and we can tell you what the government will pay you under their method if you successfully establish trees in this area of your farm. And the variation is quite different across an individual farming property. You can get some pretty big ranges from a few hundred tons of carbon on different sides of the farm. So with our tool, so I'll skip forward. This is live and currently available now, this tool that you can get in and have a go of. We call that a carbon farming heat map, and it's only applicable to reforestation projects, but we'll soon have one for plantation forestry as well. Now, we're also integrating with another software provider called FarmLab that are doing a lot of great things on soil carbon. So soon we'll have some predictive tools to help you predict your soil carbon opportunity. But soil carbon is a bit trickier because it comes so much down to your management and your proposed intervention that it's pretty hard to have these kind of broad brushstroke estimates. It's very much led by you and what you think is possible on your farm, and your agronomist and what they think is possible on your farm. But also with the FarmLab integration, we can do a whole lot of soil sample planning and a heap of other stuff that will, I can show at a later date. Now, with our tool as well, and again, this is still free, you can basically go on and you can draw plots as to where you want to put trees, for example. And then we have this little feasibility calculator where you can run through and look at costs and basically play with the sensitivities to generate some different profitability scenarios for yourself. Now, you can either do that yourself or we can assist with it, or it's the kind of thing that we're working with land care groups, for example, that potentially Kate and Joe might be able to help with this sort of thing and navigating the system to get an understanding of what's possible on your farm. Let's talk numbers. So let's get right into the nitty-gritty now. You've been patient to get this far and get into it. So let's look at 3 project examples that we've recently run. So basically a forestry project of 558 hectares in Gippsland, Victoria. Now, I believe this was a hardwood plantation, and basically they're able to generate 178 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year. Their total carbon credit issuance over the 25 years is 56,000 carbon credits. The upfront project cost would be around the $21,000 mark. Now, important clarification here is that when it comes to a project like a forestry project, these numbers are not taking into account planting the trees, because that's assumed to be part of the forestry revenue. And their whole, so basically they're going to plant the forest anyway because the timber makes sense. And then this carbon is the icing on the cake. And this is just looked at from a carbon perspective. And then they take these numbers and layer them into their own business planning, into the broader farming operation. So you're looking at 21 grand roughly up front, additional lifetime costs of about 237. The gross profit at 25 years is 1.4 million. This is at a flat carbon price of $30, just to be prudent for modelling. So the cost for them to produce a carbon credit is $4.60. And their gross profit per hectare per annum, $114 per hectare per annum. And they also obviously get saw log revenue. Now let's look at the reforestation example. So this is a 200 hectare reforestation project in New England, New South Wales. Now, pretty good carbon yields there, 370 tonnes CO2 per hectare per annum, total over the 25 years, 46,000 carbon credits, 380 grand in costs. That includes planting all the trees at quite a high per hectare cost base. Just for reference, we can plant trees in WA, we know, nearly at half the rate they can over there. Prices are just quite different. Additional lifetime cost 160 grand. The gross profit 950 grand at 25 years. Costs them $8.90 a carbon credit, and it basically turns out to be $190 per hectare per annum in gross profit. plus the added value of shelter belts and what that's going to do for their lambing rates. So this is an interesting one to look at, because in that kind of country, at the prices they're paying for land over there, $190 per hectare per annum is probably not a good enough return to displace other agricultural activities, which is good. So what this is about going, I want to put trees here anyway, because it makes sense to my system, and it's going to boost the overall productivity and resilience of my system. And this is icing on the cake. So we've got a soil carbon project, which I know have a lot of interest. This is a 2,000 hectare soil carbon project in the Great Southern region of WA. Now for this project, they are aiming over 25 years to increase their soil organic carbon by an average of 0.3% to 1 metre depth as an average. So what that means is in the top 10 centimetres, they might increase it by 1%, and they might get very little gains right down deep. But basically, on average, over a 1 metre deep profile, that is their target. So across 2,000 hectares, they would generate 400,000 carbon units. Their direct carbon project costs are about 160 grand. Again, that excludes the cost of their livestock operation and their like intervention to the livestock system, because changing their pastures and increasing their rotations, all of that is being done because it's going to have a net benefit to the farm business anyway. So they're treating carbon as a separate revenue stream. Now, I should say with this soil carbon project that the key strategy here is taking what was largely a broadacre cropping system. They're going to be ameliorating subsoil aluminium issues, ameliorating compaction, mineral imbalances in the soil, establishing multi-species perennial pastures, and implementing very holistically managed planned grazing across the property. And they're working with a proven agronomist who has built soil carbon on other farms in the region. So they're looking at a gross profit of $11 million over 25 years. They should produce carbon credits for around $2.28, and they're looking at a gross profit per hectare per annum of $222 on top of their sheep and livestock operation. So pretty attractive returns there. So what I've done for you is I've broken each of those examples out in a little bit more detail for you, and I've shown you what it looks like at a $30 and a $50 carbon price. So this will just come through in the notes after for you to have a look at. We don't have the time to go through it all now. So the 3 examples are lined up there in detail for you to consider. So how do we help with this feasibility? If you want to get started and look at this, this is a potential option on your farm. Basically, we have all these free software tools. We also have a heap of free knowledge and resources available. And then if you want us to generate one of those colourful heat maps to see what is possible on your land, that costs $100.05 a hectare. So it's not a huge cost. A 2,000 hectare farm will cost you about $200, if I did my maths right. And the next step beyond that, once you've been able to crunch the numbers yourself and look at the ballpark and back of envelope and go, is this even a real opportunity for me? Is that we can produce a really in-depth feasibility report for you, which is really honing in on the numbers. It's costs, financial assessment, cash flow model. Let's look at a low, medium, high scenario. What happens if the price goes up, price goes down? And it's also looking at, is this reasonable to expect this is possible in my region? What are the risks and success factors? And it also comes with quite a detailed guide to how you follow the rules of the method. This is $1,500 basically per project type. Now, we can also provide custom advice as you need it. And again, this is just hourly rate. As you need help, whatever you need help with, we can support you. We're obviously looking to partner a lot with local groups such as Landcare. So hopefully you'll hear things soon from further work that we might be doing together with Lower Blackwood, LCDC, but we can talk about that down the track. Again, no obligation or exclusivity with us. If you go through this process and decide to sign on with another carbon project developer, we don't mind. At least the carbon project's happening. That's what we're all about. All right, question and answer. That was solid. A lot of information piled into a short period of time. But again, you'll get these notes so you can go through it again in your own time.
Yeah, thanks, Lachy. I thought that was brilliant. And made things a lot clearer for me. And I've heard it a couple of times, so it's even better now the second time around. I've really got it into my head now, I think. So we've got a few questions here, and I think there's a few questions related to the risk of reversal. So I might just get you to go over that a little bit again. What happens if carbon credits have to be paid back? So this first question is looking at if you look after credits for, you choose 100 years, you receive all the payments in the first 25 years, and then what happens? Who checks after the further 75 years if you've received all the carbon credits in the first 25 years? I think you kind of answered that, but maybe you can just go over that again.
Yeah, so look, you do have an obligation to maintain compliance. So they do keep an eye on it. If it's a tree plantation, for example, they keep an eye on it with satellite monitoring. Soil carbon, to be honest, how they actually monitor that over 75 to 100 years, I know that you don't have to do sampling and testing again after the end of your crediting period. But what you do have to do is submit reports. I believe it's every 5 or 10 years. Again, we're getting into quite technical detail now, and I've got a whole team who handle that stuff so that I don't have to be across all the methods. Basically, you do have to submit reports of a third party saying, yes, you are still maintaining the activity and there's no reason to believe the carbon would be gone. So that's kind of how they do police it. And then look, if there is a failure or any reason to believe that the carbon's gone backwards, you do ultimately have to pay back the carbon credits.
And that kind of leads on to the next question then. So when you're paying back the credit, it's just the credit. It's whatever value. I mean, this question has asked about whether it's paid back at current market value, but I mean, a credit's a credit, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So you don't have to pay them cash. You pay them credits. Yeah. So this is one thing that's really important to be clear on. If you sell credits for $30 today, and then in 10 years' time the price is $100. And you have to pay back carbon credits, you got to go out and buy them for $100 and pay them back to the regulator. So the regulator accepts carbon, they don't accept cash. So it's really, and that's why we really hammer on about this idea of controlling your carbon and not contracting it away to third parties, because you don't want to sell heaps of it up front for a low price and then be stuck later.
Yeah, it's a bit like sort of blue chip shares that you hang on to for a long time. They'll have grown by the time you get to the end of it. So you really, if it's 25 years long, you're free and clear after 25 years. If it's a 100 years project, then it's for future generations, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and look, to be honest, a lot of the people we're talking to genuinely see this as superannuation or as a legacy that they're going to hand on to their kids. So a lot of people are doing this and going, look, we're just going to bank and accumulate these credits, and one day in the future, our kids or grandkids will cash this in, because they want to make all the changes anyway in the system, and it makes sense to get more carbon pumping and flowing in the system because it's better for their productivity and resilience. So it's really getting into that mindset of this is a long game and a long-term strategy.
Yeah. Okay. So moving away from the credit side of things. Michelle has asked, there are a number of methods, example, grazing, fodder shrubs that have co-benefits, example, grow more wool, less methane emitted, increase ground cover and store soil carbon. Other methodologies are not available in WA, for example, human-induced forest regeneration, fence off and stop grazing. However, these don't appear to be available for WA. Are there plans to overcome this?
Yeah, so look, the human-induced regeneration method is available in WA, and it's used throughout the southern rangelands. It generally applies to that broad rangelands context, not really in the high rainfall or wet sheep zones. Basically, look, the way it works, like I said up front in the preso, there are a whole raft of different methods, a whole heap of different flavors out there, and it's just a case of what will work on my farm, what is currently available, and trying to get those things to fit. So I guess that the roundabout answer to your question, Michelle, is that there's a whole heap of methods. Some are in WA, some aren't. And really, it just comes down to who's going to be the first person to do it, who's going to bring it to WA. Now, we've got our focus because we're responding to what we know works and what people want within our target area of the wheat, sheep and high rainfall zones. So we are progressively bringing new methods into our toolkit. It's just a case of we can only bite off one at a time. And
about methodology then, Greg asks, if you undertake a carbon project with a new practice that's now, and then over time other practices come along, are you able to change practices and still get paid for increased carbon? Or would that be a whole new project that you'd have to take on? Oh, Lochy's frozen. Is that just for me or is that for everybody? Or have I frozen? Oh, seems like Lochy's frozen. Hopefully he'll be back shortly. Sorry, everybody.
It's streaming correctly, mate, just without me. Oh, we're back.
You're back. Did you get that question, Lachy?
Sorry, I missed that one. I got no idea what happened there. It just freaked out on me. Can you please?
Okay. So Greg's asking about when new methodologies come along and you're already in a project that's using a particular type of methodology, can you add that methodology into the project, or is that a new project? You know.
So this is Greg Smith's question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when it comes to, for example, Greg, with the soil carbon method, basically there's quite a broad range of approved activities that constitute a new or additional activity. So you do get flexibility over time to change your practices according to basically as long as a new activity or materially different activity from where you were 25 years ago, or where you were from the start of your project, is implemented, you do have some flexibility there. The other thing to note with the soil carbon project in particular is you divide your farm up into different zones called carbon estimation areas, and then you divide them further into different strata. So within the carbon estimation areas, you can implement different activities across different areas, and you can move them around depending on your farming system. So the Willamby project that I showed you a picture of earlier on in the Prezzo, for example, there some of those areas are going to be exclusively grazed. Some are going to have a crop rotation every 3 or 4 years, and there's flexibility there to change the practice as long as it's going to build carbon and it fits within the rule book. And presumably, as they update rule books, they usually let you either stick with the original version or bring yourself in line with the new rule book. So they're quite flexible in that regard. So especially soil carbon projects, there's a degree of flexibility here. They want you to run a profitable farming business, and they get that science and things shift over time.
And surely the main point is sequestering carbon.
Exactly. Look, and what we're hoping to see and we're predicting is that a lot of these methods, as we get better and better at sensing and measuring results, a lot of these rules around what you can and can't do, how you do it, all of that will slowly evaporate in favor of just real-time accurate measurement. And if you're measuring carbon and you're achieving the outcome, you get paid for it. That's the future that we're hoping to see.
Yeah. There's a couple of questions about size, and I think that's an important question. How small is too small in terms of hectares to participate?
Yeah, look, it's a really, we get asked that question a lot, and sadly, I don't have a square answer for you. So we have looked at, for example, what would be considered a very small reforestation project of 40 or 50 hectares. Most carbon project developers won't touch anything less than 200 hectares. So we've looked at 40 and 50 hectare projects that look quite good and look really profitable under our do-it-yourself model where the landowner's more involved and costs are low. So it really depends on the project. I think you would generally struggle to see anything below 50 hectares stacking up. More likely 100 hectares, potentially even 200 hectares needed to get the economies of scale. One thing I didn't really touch on in the Prezzo is just that with your costs, you do have quite a few costs that are effectively fixed costs. So whether it's a small or a large project, you've still got to do an offset report. If you need to be audited, it's the same cost roughly. They change a little bit, but generally it's a fixed cost. So if you can spread those costs out across more hectares, you're obviously going to have a much more viable project. So one of the things that we are looking at, for example, is, well, can a lot of small farmers in a region pull together and team up to run one carbon project? So it's important to note that one carbon project can spread across multiple farms. So you can spread an individual carbon project across a very broad regional area and pull everyone together under one carbon project and share those fixed costs.
Yeah, and I guess in this region, that's probably quite an interesting point, because there are a lot of smaller farms around, and so aggregating together. So that's something that we might look at considering helping out with, but we'll have to see in the future. It can be quite complex as well. So I have a question actually, Lachy, regarding value adding your carbon credits. I know I asked you this in a podcast we had recently, but I want to ask it again. Are there any ways of increasing the value of your carbon credits than just a soil carbon credit, for example, or
exactly. It's a good point. So I mentioned really early on that the market is getting more and more interested in quality alongside just quantity of carbon credits. And what they're starting to look at is things like, what are the additional biodiversity values that you're adding to the farm? Is there local cultural or social impact that you're having with this project that basically means it's got a better story, and therefore buyers are going to pay you more for it? So it's basically like anything else you sell. If you can wrap it up around a good brand and a good story, the more accredited and credible that story is, the more likely you're able to achieve a price premium. So the analogy is that if you go into the supermarket and buy a steak and you see one that's got a grass-fed label, a certified grass-fed stamp, certified animal welfare stamp, and a certified organic stamp, each of those badges are helping that product to try and get a price premium. And we're going to see the same thing in carbon credits.
Yep. So yeah, you really have to. This is when you want to go and sell them. Obviously, if you're holding them onto as an investment, a superannuation thing, then maybe it's not such a consideration. Although keeping the story of how, for future reference is important, isn't it? So that when you do get to sell them, you've got something to say about it.
Yeah, and look, much the same way that you can't just go around saying you're organic and necessarily get away with it without some kind of proof and accreditation. There is other people working on like biodiversity accreditations, for example, that would like layer on top of your carbon credit. So with those sort of things, you obviously have to get in early because you've got to measure and prove what you're doing. So it might be that you get the payoff in a lot of years' time, but if you can measure the results and prove that you're doing something differently, then it does make sense.
And also, quite apart from the sort of the risk mitigation aspects of holding on to your credits, what about the aspect of carbon neutrality for farmers? That plays into it as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I think it's something to be clear on, because some people, we have had discussions where people have got a bit tangled up around this topic. Is you can't generate the carbon credits, sell them, and then claim carbon neutrality. You're basically selling your right to be carbon neutral to someone else. So if you produce this many emissions on your farm every year, let's say you try and reduce your emissions as best you can, get it all as low as you can, and you produce this many emissions, and then you produce this many carbon credits. If you want to be carbon neutral, you have to surrender the equivalent number of carbon credits in tons to the tons of emissions you produce in a year. They have to cancel each other out. So if you need to be carbon neutral, you're going to need carbon credits, because it's going to be pretty hard to, it's possible. The ideal scenario is that you produce this many emissions, but you produce this many carbon credits, and you can retire this many and then sell the extras. That's the ideal scenario of what we all hope to see ag eventually doing. So it is an important thing just to consider that as the world marches to carbon neutrality and there's more and more requirement for carbon neutrality, it could be that agricultural product needs to be carbon neutral to access certain premium markets, for example. In which case, you're probably going to want to keep the carbon credits. That's the high level is that ultimately keeping carbon credits is a good idea because you might need them, and if you do need them in the future, the sooner you get started, you'll be a step ahead of everyone else. Because you'll already have some carbon credits in the bank. It takes, as you saw from the presentation, it takes quite a long time to build up your carbon credits and start to get carbon credits issued and flowing. So the sooner you start, the better.
Lisa has asked, wants to go back to your point about operating as a not-for-profit. How, in the case of risk reversal, how are you giving back to farmers, and are you directing funds to locals?
Yeah, sure. So look, we're backed by an individual donor, and basically we are spending a mountain more money than we're earning in fees. So any fees that are generated are going into our operations and keeping our programs and activities going. I'll just flick to a couple of I'll come back to that takeaway slide, but I'll just jump on here, for example. So a couple of things that we're currently doing that are available is that the DIY carbon software tool that we showed you a little bit of in the presentation, there's a whole lot of free stuff in there that's currently available for free for people to use to do high-level assessments of profitability. So that's one of the examples of us giving back. The other one is we run a website called CFF News. So you can go on to carbonfarming.org.au and find CFF News, and there you can subscribe. And it's basically a knowledge hub and knowledge base that we're spending a lot of money on journalists and people to pull all this information and knowledge together. And then coming soon, we're going to start working on the Carbon Farming Academy. So this will be an online free training centre for people to come and learn everything about carbon farming. So a lot of what I presented and going into all the fine-grained detail of all the different methods, all the different possibilities. So a lot of what we're doing for free to give back is outreach, education, awareness, and building things in that capacity.
Well, thanks for that question, Lisa. I didn't know Lachy was going to do that, so that's interesting. A question from Bree Brown. How long will it be before CFF can provide evidence through clients' projects as to the successful sequestration of carbon, and how that is tracking in comparison with modelled amounts? 5 years in line with reporting periods? She's asking.
Yeah, look, we should have some decent results within 3. Is the answer. So Willamby project that we're a partner in, it's baseline sampling now, and we have this is a soil carbon project, and what we're using on that project is we're using a spectroscopy. I always get the two words mixed up, but we're basically using a handheld reader that can measure soil carbon live in field. So we will actually, from the baseline period, we will start testing regularly, and we should start to see some gains over the first 3 years is the plan. So that project in particular will be publicly sharing all the lessons and knowledge. So another part of what we're trying to do, again, is make this whole industry more transparent and get more information into the hands of landowners. So we're hoping within kind of 2-3 years, we'll start sharing that data, and then it'll be credible and real. But yes, the carbon game takes time, and that's just the reality of what we're working with.
Yeah. Well, I think that, look, we've come to the end of the questions. Oh no, someone's still typing. Looks like.
Someone's typing. Well, I have some wrap-up slides as well. One wrap-up slide as well.
Can you talk more about the technology? What is it, and who provides it? Okay.
Yeah, sure. So that's a company called Hone Ag, Hone. So if you Google search Hone Carbon, you can find details about the spectrometry unit. We use it as standard in our soil carbon projects because it saves you that much money. Basically, what it does is you have to submit a whole heap of samples to the lab, but if you're using this machine, it means the next time around you can send a lot fewer samples to the lab, because you send machine results and lab sample results, and the government methodology accepts this like combination of the two methods to measure the carbon in the soil. And it also means you've got this handheld unit, so you can go around year on year checking paddocks and seeing what's working and what's not, and use it to influence your land management strategy. So it's well worth looking at that tool. We see it as a no-brainer.
Great. So you've got a few takeaways for us.
Yeah, just the takeaways. Like, I'm aware there's a fair bit to get your head around, but really, if there's a few points that I can leave everyone with, it's really that it's about first and foremost focusing on new activities that boost resilience and productivity in your system. Like I said, it's just another crop, and it's about looking at how can I get more carbon pumping and flowing in my system anyway, and then the carbon credits. You then think about which rule book applies to me, and is it possible for me to make some money out of carbon farming on top of that? Now, look, it isn't that hard with a bit of guidance. It's complicated, not complex. The rule books this is. So it's just about breaking things down into step-by-step chunks and going from one step to the next, slowly. And that's really what we're about, is helping people through that process. And the other thing, I'm sure this point's come across, but control your credits. If I can stress one thing, it's keep control of them, as many of them as you can.
Yep. Well, that's it. I think that's a really, really clear explanation, Lachy. So thank you very much. And I really hope that any of you have been previously put off by the thought of all the red tape and the process to even get to the planning stage. Will be encouraged to log on to the CFF website and have a go at some of their feasibility tools. You might as well, because they're free. So it's pretty easy to find them on your website, Lachy?
Yeah, just jump on the carbonfarming.org.au, and everything is easy to find. If you have any problems, just reach out to us through the website, and we can help to get you started. And basically we're here to help you map out this feasibility process, get to understand the numbers, and really look at, is this going to work for you on your farm?
Well, thanks once again, Lachy. We really appreciate you taking the time to come and present for us today, and we wish you and the Carbon Farming Foundation all the best.